And we are live. Welcome everybody back to Sigmar Academy World History 1900 to present. Today we will be looking at Asia at the turn of the 20th century. So, the first slide we have is our overview. Asia at the turn of the 20th century was a tumultuous place marred by violent wars and political instability. Since the late 19th century, several major regional powers were industrializing. Industrialization and the modernization of militaries would play a key role in shaping Asian politics and warfare going into the preceding decades. And here we can see on the left is an artistic rendition of the First Sino-Japanese War, and on the right we can see a painting of the Boxer Rebellion, and we will get into both of these conflicts in the preceding slides. So, if we go on to the next slide. The first topic we're going to discuss is the Meiji Restoration. So, the Edo period of Japan lasted from 1603 to 1868 and was characterized by strict isolationism, feudalism, politically powerful daimyo and samurai classes, and the rule of shoguns. But in 1853 through 1854, U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry led a series of 2 naval expeditions to force Japan to open its ports to trade with the West. The Japanese acquiesced to American gunboat diplomacy, ending over 200 years of Japan's self-imposed isolation. So on the left, we can see a painting of Commodore Perry's ships arriving in the port of Yokohama, I believe. And on the right, there's a picture of Commodore Matthew Perry himself. So if we go on to the next slide. A decade after Commodore Perry's expedition, the ruling Tokugawa shogunate would be overthrown. During the Edo period, the emperor was a ceremonial role while the shogun held real political power. During the Meiji period, the emperor's political power was restored. In February 3rd of 1867, the Emperor Meiji assumed the throne upon the death of his father. The following years would be characterized by the transition from feudal society to centralized government, rapid industrialization, and trade with foreign powers. So on the right, we can see a painting of the Emperor Meiji. This is really important because the Tokugawa shogunate had ruled Japan for nearly 200 years, over 200 years actually. And now the reign of shoguns are coming to an end. Japan is getting its emperor back. And this will mark the end of the Edo period as Japan enters its Meiji period. So if we go on to the next slide. The effects of the Meiji Restoration were positive and negative. In the span of a few decades, the rapid industrialization turned Japan into one of Asia's strongest and richest powers. However, the modernization of the period also saw the destruction of hundreds of beautiful, traditional Japanese castles, as the government saw no need in maintaining them. So if we look at the bottom of the screen, we can first see a chart showing coal production in Japan from the years 1875 to 1913. In 1875, Japan was barely producing any coal whatsoever. It didn't need to, it didn't have an industrialized navy yet. But by 1913, this had changed, and you can see that coal production skyrocketed. Same thing on the next chart with the size of the merchant fleet. In 1873, Japan only had 26 steamships, whereas in 1913, it had over 1,500. So thanks to industrialization, Japan is building a modern navy, it is modernizing as a country, and it will become one of Asia's dominant powers because of it. So this is all well and good. However, the negative side of the Meiji Restoration is the corrosive effect it has on traditional Japanese culture. On the right, you can see a picture of a traditional Japanese castle. It looks very beautiful, I must say. But the Meiji period saw the destruction of, I think, nearly 2,000 of these castles, and Japanese architecture at this time would transition from these traditional style architecture to appearing more modern. So, if we go on to the next slide. The First Sino-Japanese War. In the late 19th century, as Japan's power grew, China's waned. China at the time was ruled by the Qing dynasty and had long been the dominant regional power of Asia. This would change after the First Sino-Japanese War, which was from 1894 to 1895. The war was primarily over influence in Korea. In the 1880s, Korea was a turbulent place plagued by drought and famine. The government was propped up by the Qing dynasty, while reformers, dissatisfied with the status quo, favored Japan. Korea was strategically important for both China and Japan. For China, it served as a client state and a buffer. For For Japan, it was the source of agricultural and raw material imports. This put China and Japan at loggerheads over influence in the peninsula, which was exacerbated by the 1894 assassination of pro-Japanese Korean revolutionary Kim Ok-gyun. So if we go on to the next slide. Kim's assassination inflamed tensions between Japan and China. However, the catalyst for war revolved around the Donghak Rebellion. Korean peasants, upset with burdensome taxes and government mismanagement, launched a revolt. Japan's policy was to send troops into Korea if the Chinese sent theirs first. Although the rebellion was destined to fail, inaccurate reports convinced Chinese officials that Korea was on the brink of collapse. The Chinese sent troops to quell the situation, which prompted Japan to do the same, sparking war. And there you can see on the left is a flag of Qing Dynasty China. It's very famous because it's yellow and it has a dragon on it. And on the right is the flag of the rising sun, which was the flag of Japan. So if we go on to the next slide. The strength of the two armies was asymmetrical. China's army was much larger, but was not a modern fighting force. Japan's military, while smaller, was more modern, possessed naval superiority, and took cues from superior European tactics. The war went poorly for China, and a year later, Qing officials sued for peace. So here you can see on the left is another painting depicting the First Sino-Japanese War, and on the right we can see the strength as well as the casualties of both sides. China had around 357,000 men in its army in Korea, while Japan had 240,000. China would suffer over twice the losses of the Japanese, as the Japanese Navy just steamrolled the Chinese, and the Japanese army had better tactics inspired by European generals. So the war goes very poorly for China, and Japan cements its influence in Korea. So if we go on to the next slide. The Boxer Rebellion. After China's defeat to Japan, China suffered a series of internal problems including poor harvest, economic troubles, and the flooding of the Yellow River, which is in northern China. Many Chinese peasants were impoverished and resorted to banditry in the northern provinces. Exacerbating public anger was the fact that many of the bandits claimed to be Christian. The Qing dynasty was obligated by treaties with Europeans to grant favorable legal treatment to Christians and Christian missionaries. In many cases, the bandits claimed to be Christian to help shield themselves from prosecution. So if we go on, the Qing government was unable to manage the problem of banditry in its north. In response to government impotence, several secret societies took matters into their own hands. One such secret society was the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists. So if we go on to the next slide. The Righteous and Harmonious Fists were labeled Boxers by foreign European observers due to their use of traditional martial arts. The Boxers were comprised mainly of rural, impoverished, young men who resented domination by foreign powers and the diminishment of traditional Chinese culture. The Boxers were influenced by mysticism and held a series of unusual beliefs. Some of these ideas included the claims that they were immune to gunfire, that they could communicate with ancient deities, and that in the event of widespread rebellion, millions of divine soldiers from the heavens would descend to liberate China from imperialist powers. In terms of ideology, the Boxers were nativist, anti-imperialist, anti-Christian, and mystical in terms of their spiritual outlook. And on the right we can see a depiction of a Boxer soldier. They used martial arts and they used melee weapons, they did not use guns, and there is their insignia on the right. They were quite an unusual group who believed that they couldn't be hurt by gunfire. This was obviously not the case, but there were so many of them and they had popular support on their side because the Qing government was totally at the behest of foreign powers and not putting the Chinese people first. So if we go on to the next slide. The Boxers began killing Chinese Christians and foreigners in 1899 through 1900. They initially fought against the Qing government forces who they saw as corrupt and weak, but that would not remain the case for long. On June 10, 1900, prompted by the murder of foreigners and Christians, the Eight-Nation Alliance was formed to put down the Boxers. This alliance consisted of Britain, Russia, Japan, France, Germany, the United States, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. On June 21, 1900, the Qing joined forces with the Boxers and declared war on the Eight-Nation Alliance. Some provinces broke from the Qing's decision and were neutral in the conflict. Most of these provinces were in the southeast. So it's important when we're talking about the Qing dynasty to remember that China is not composed of only one ethnic group. There are several different Chinese ethnicities within the borders of China. When you say Chinese, most people will think of Han Chinese, which is the predominant ethnic group, but the Qing dynasty were a dynasty from the north, and they were from an ethnic group called the Manchus. So the Manchus had governance over China and over the other ethnic groups, and a lot of the Chinese in the south, who were not ethnically Manchu, didn't agree with the Qing's decision and remained neutral in the conflict. We'll go more in depth into the ethnic divides in China when we talk about the collapse of the Qing dynasty in a few slides. So if we go on to the next slide. Boxers and Qing forces besieged the European legation quarter in the south of Beijing, which is also called Peking. The European legations were besieged for 55 days before the siege was broken by Allied armies. This event is the subject of the famous song 55 Days in Peking, which I'm sure you've heard. Even if you don't recognize the title, I'm sure you've heard the melody of that song. The alliance defeated the Qing forces, although many Boxer rebels fled to the countryside. Peace concessions were made by the Qing to alliance members. Russia occupied much of Manchuria, and the Qing dynasty was now weaker than ever, laying the ground for its collapse. So, if we go on to the next slide. The Russo-Japanese War. As a result of the First Sino-Japanese War and the Boxer Rebellion, China lost influence in Korea and Manchuria to Japan and Russia, respectively. Despite being allied against China, Russia and Japan would soon find themselves at loggerheads in 1904. Japan feared Russian encroachment and made an offer to the Tsar. Russia would maintain its influence in Manchuria while recognizing Japan's influence in Korea. The Russians refused, wanting a buffer zone between the two spheres of influence. Negotiations broke down, prompting Japan to launch a surprise attack on Port Arthur, home to much of Russia's warm-water Pacific Fleet. Now, this surprise attack on Port Arthur was extremely successful and nearly wiped out the entire Russian fleet. And interestingly, it would inform the Japanese decision to launch a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor when we get to World War II. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, and if we go on to the next slide. The war went poorly for Russia and was seen as a humiliating defeat at the hands of a backwards Asiatic military. The war would spark a 1905 revolution against the Tsar, which was ultimately unsuccessful. For Japan, this victory not only cemented their influence in Korea, but it also raised their standing in the eyes of Europeans as a serious world power. Japan would later annex Korea in 1910. And you can see there is a map of the war. After the Boxer Rebellion, Russia had its influence in Manchuria, while Japan had its in Korea. And the war does not go well for the Russians and secures Japanese control over Korea. So if we go on to the next slide. The Young Turk Revolution. East Asia was not the only part of the continent that experienced political instability. In Asia Minor, the Ottoman Sultan Abdul Hamid II faced a constitutionalist revolt in 1908 that sought to restore the Ottoman constitution and establish a parliament. The Sultan's opposition were called the Young Turks and consisted of socialists, Democrats, and the Committee of Union and Progress, also called the CUP, which was a revolutionary group, secret society, and political party from 1889 to 1926. And there you can see on the left is a picture of the insignia of the Union and Progress Party, and on the right is Sultan Abdul Hamid II. If we go on to the next slide. The Young Turks successfully achieved power in 1908 and ushered in the Ottoman Empire's second constitutional era, which would last until the empire's demise. Oh, damn it, another typo. This is what I get for doing it late at night. Oh well. The Sultan was rendered a monarch bound by Parliament and the Constitution. In late March, early April of 1909, monarchist forces loyal to Abdul Hamid II attempted to restore the absolute monarchy by drawing on populist sentiment. Hamid promised to restore the caliphate, eliminate secular policies, and implement Sharia law. He was supported by conservative generals, clerics, and believing Muslims within the empire. Army forces loyal to the CUP defeated Hamid's supporters and removed him from the throne in favor of his half-brother Mehmed V, who was easier to control and had limited political power. So if we go on to the next slide. Qing dynasty collapse. Returning now to China, the first decade of the 20th century was marked by a worsening economic and political situation. The Qing dynasty had lost 2 wars and imperial authority was brittle. To quell discontent, the Qing implemented reforms in the middle of the decade. In 1905, the Qing court abolished the examination system, worked to modernize its military, and attempted a limited decentralization of the government. The reforms ultimately failed to appease the malcontents, and in 1911, the Qing faced a revolution led by Sun Yat-sen. He was a doctor from the south of China who desired a nationalist, republican government underpinned by some socialist ideas. Sun had been educated in Hawaii and gathered support in the south of China from Chinese diaspora in the west and from students. And interesting to note is that when the revolution started, Sun Yat-sen was actually not in China, and he heard about it through a newspaper. But he would go back to China, and the revolutionaries would call for him to become president of a new republic in China. So if we go on to the next slide. At the commencement of the revolution, Sun Yat-sen was not in China. He was in the West seeking financial support for revolutionary forces, albeit unsuccessfully. However, while he was absent, Qing officials were increasingly expelled from their offices or murdered in the southern provinces. And here you can see again, I said earlier in the lecture we would talk about the ethnic divides in China. The Qing are Manchus, which come from Manchuria and Beijing. However, when people talk about Chinese, the most common Chinese ethnicity is Han Chinese, and they're in the central and southern parts of the country. Qing influence is in the north, whereas the southern provinces were less keen on Qing rule. This goes back to the Ming dynasty, which was based in south-central China and was overthrown by the Qing Manchus from the north. So there is that ethnic tension within China, and the southern provinces were more ripe for supporting Sun Yat-sen than Chinese in the north. So if we go on to the next slide, here we can see a picture of Sun Yat-sen, and there is his flag on the right. It's the blue flag with a white sun, and if it looks familiar, it's because the modern-day Taiwanese flag uses this banner in the corner of its flag. And the modern Taiwanese flag is the old Republic of China flag, which was the flag of China before the communists won the Chinese Civil War. So if we go on to the next slide, Sun met with Yuan Shikai, a general holding the Qing military together, and reached a deal. Yuan would convince the Qing child emperor to abdicate and make China a republic. In return, Sun would cede the presidency of the nascent republic to Yuan. In the following months, one big point of contention revolved around the Chinese capital. Sun and the Han Chinese ethnic group desired the capital to be in Nanking rather than Peking. The southern Chinese provinces were done with Manchu rule of China. And I talked about this on a previous slide, but there is that ethnic divide between the Qing Manchus and the rest of the Chinese ethnicities. I'm not sure if Sun himself was Han Chinese, he may have been one of the other ethnic groups, but it's really everyone else versus the Manchus and the ruling Qing dynasty. Yuan promised to move the capital to Nanking, but reneged on this promise. Tensions rose as Yuan gave himself more power and eventually did away with the constitution. He declared democracy a failure and the nationalists to be rebels. Sun's new party, the Kuomintang, rose arms against Yuan, but could not defeat his larger and more powerful army. And if we go on to the next slide, a changing China. Sun plotted to overthrow Yuan while in exile in Japan. However, Yuan would die in 1916. The country then devolved into rule by warlords. These warlords had been given regional control by Yuan Shikai, but after his death and seeing a power vacuum, operated independently without a central personality to keep them in line. China remained chaotic in the years following Yuan's death. After World War I, the Treaty of Versailles ceded some Chinese territory to Japan, despite China being an allied power. Enraged by this betrayal and without influence outside of Guangzhou, Sun looked to the Soviets and Russia for financial help. Sun wrote prolifically and became more anti-colonialist in his views, but would die in 1925 and never saw his nationalists take power. 3 years after his death, the Kuomintang would take Beijing under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek. So this is very interesting because Sun is soliciting help from the Soviets, who were trying to take control over Russia during the early 20s, and one of the ways he did this was becoming increasingly anti-colonialist in his writings. Now, Sun Yat-sen was not a communist. There were communists in China in the 20s, but they were just getting started. They didn't have the power yet to challenge Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang, but were seeing the ground being set for the Chinese Civil War. So ultimately, Su never got to see the Kuomintang lead a Republic of China. However, his successor, Chiang Kai-shek, would accomplish this feat 3 years after his death. So if we go on to the next slide, we have our takeaways. So the first takeaway is, Asia around the turn of the 20th century was a tumultuous continent marred by war, political and economic instability, and famines. Asian powers, most notably Japan, began to industrialize in the late 19th century. The Japanese would attain great power status through a series of victories in wars against China and Russia. And do ignore the typos, I'm sorry about this. I did this late at night, right before I was going to bed. That's what I get for that. And 3, the Qing dynasty was brittle and by 1912 collapsed, plunging China into decades of instability before the Kuomintang under Chiang Kai-shek seized power. And our vocabulary for this lecture is the following. Make sure you are able to define Edo period, shogun, Commodore Matthew Perry, gunboat diplomacy, Meiji period / the Meiji Restoration, First Sino-Japanese War, Boxer Rebellion, Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists, the Eight Nation Alliance, Russo-Japanese War, the Young Turks, Sun Yat-sen, Kuomintang, and Chiang Kai-shek. So, thank you everybody for listening. I appreciate all of you, and I hope to see you all next time. And most importantly, have a good day.